So welcome to Breaking Bread. What this work is today, what the talk is about, this informal conversation, which begins with me laying out an idea or a series of ideas on which we will later discuss. So what this orientation is about is how it is as dancers, we are in relations with our world through the articulation of our presence. And that means in performance, that means in our everyday lives. Because of course, the one is not dissimilar from the other, except in that maybe emotionally it feels very much different. And in terms of what we're focusing on, so our attention will feel very much different. And yet, the underlying availability of changing our presence and articulation means that we change in such a way that we almost create a language, if not a language, an actual language, through how we are present, not from the point of view of necessarily of me being present to myself, but of the effect of my being in the world. So when I say the articulation of presence, I'm really looking at the effect of my being in the world and what that is and how my current experience influences that. So I'm looking at the relationality of my being in the world as a presence that influences it. And this is material that arose as important to me through the development of contact improvisation and through all the work I have done with ensemble dance improvisation. It's interesting. It also interests me very much because I noticed, of course, as everyone did, that some people on stage, you can't take your eyes off, and other people, they barely show up. They hide in plain sight on stage. And I noticed these differences and was curious about it. I also was very curious about the difference between contact improvisation and dance ensemble improvisation, not from the perspective of its material differences, which were huge. One is a highly visual form, the other is a highly tactile form. One is interested in shape and play in time. The other is interested in the physics of motion and the time that allows us to be present to it, how it is we change and shape our experiential time, not simply some external metering of time. So these are very, very different attentional orientations, and they massively change how I would experience people as present, as a presence in the world. Now, I added to today's talk this interest in somatic extension because that sense of being a larger form, of being a form that is not bound by the flesh, of being a mind that is a physical mind, is significant to my understanding of presence, because it is the physical mind that is in my work that I would call the organizing element that opens and closes presence. So presence extends, presence contracts, presence is shapes within the world according to what we're attending, how we're in attention. So imagine two people who are deeply in love walking down a street. And the thickness of that coupling, that thickness of that relationship that is shaping because of their attention to one another within that form. And the difference in how that shaping is in relation to, say, it's in their environment, including the other people on the street. And you can see that in relation to, or compare that to someone walking down the street, a child walking down the street that is interested in everything with a darting attention. And the way their presence, they're as relational as changing the environment that they touch. Very different. One is organizing within itself, and the other is organizing as this bright star. Hello, Kamnush. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Great. So that's the subject of our conversation. And that the subject of the conversation has something to do with somatic experiencing. Soma being a word that Thomas Hanna developed, and really to mean one's internal sense of the self, one's internal experience, felt sensing, that has everything to do with well-being and how we are in the world, the state of being. I look at that, and because of how I understand presence, I do not understand presence as being flesh bound, but as being something that extends as a world. And the more that one allows a larger sense of self, the more one is present as a world, and potentially the world is present to you. When I am on stage and my attention is not just within the box of the stage. If my attention is within the box of the stage, that's what people get. It doesn't cross over that fourth wall, which everyone knows, extend beyond the fourth wall. Why? Because presence goes with you, goes with that extension. The articulation of presence is magical in so many ways. It is this finely organizing tactility, and I call it tactile because it is, I am touched by the world constantly. Alvanoe, I've said this many times, speaks of the world as everything touches everything. And that sense that all of our senses, whether it's visual, whether it's taste, whether it's sound, all of it is a function of touch. It's not a function, they arrive differently, but it's all touch because it's all waveforms producing change. So that change is exciting. All of the variations of tactile presence. So presence is tactile. Wrote a paper with Joe Dumet on articulating presence and the tactility of attention. I'm going to turn to my dissertation, though, today in talking about some of this, because how we embody our attention, especially how we embody its physicality, is important within an understanding of articulating presence. I'm here thinking about the word Heidegger developed, Dasein, and Dasein is his way of talking about being in the world. And it's this might be a word you know and have worked with. Is it, Alex? Have you worked with this word, Dasein? This notion of being in the world? Julia, have you? No? Okay, good, good. That notion of in the worldness is an interesting notion, because the sense that one is necessarily coupled with the world, one is inextractable, and you've got the problem of being is the problem of being in the world. And that one is necessarily present. Now, that being in the world means one is necessarily relational, and that relationality moves through one's presence as a being. And one's attention, as I'm speaking about it, is constitutive of one's presence to a degree. It is the articulating factor. And I think infants know this quite well. They use the volume, so do children. Julia's with children. They understand that to get the attention they need, they have to be a big presence. And they'll use every and any means they can in order to do that, in order to get, because attention is like food. That's a whole other conversation, but they will articulate. They've learned from a very young age to be in that relations with the world they are present. And I wouldn't say in, I would use the term as, present as the world. Because when I study what I would call somatic extension, that articulation allows me to be engaged in what Merleau-Ponty calls intercorporality. I am an articulating corporeal being as a presence with others that are present, or other being that is present. So if I'm walking with a cane, my whole body will organize around that cane, with that cane as me. We know this from studies of proprioception. My proprioception, my brain will start to perceive the end point of that cane, and I will articulate it very much as I might articulate my fingers, you know, in terms of organizing my proprioceptive knowledge of nearness, farness, location in space. But it's more than just that. It's also that the tactility of my attentional being is present, or has the potential to be present, as the plant I carry in my arm, or the tree that I am dancing with. When I allow a sense of self that is extensive, somatically extensive, I have the possibility of being moved, being touched by a tree as a very physical phenomenon. And so too, and here's imagination, I start to imagine the potential that the tree is also touched by me, because my attention is tactile, because I am inseparably engaged as a world. I want to turn to Spinoza right now, because I think I've used that word imagine, and it's really very, very important word, because the imagination is for me, attention is highly creative, and it is highly creative because we imagine the possibility of knowing. We imagine the possibility of being present in our world, the ways we are present in our world. So I want to turn to speak of, oh, I want to know, before I go there, I'm looking at a note from my dissertation and thinking about cognitive scientist Sean Gallagher, who writes, there is a direct resonance between my bodily behavior and the bodily behavior of another. Of course, we know this. You know, contact improvisation is based in this function, in this action. Modulating through uncertainty, we align our actions with our intentions as performers of those actions, even when the intention is simply to be awake to our experience. So we're constantly organizing ourselves as performers of what we do, with the desire to be awake to our experience. Erin Manning says, she considers the sensing bodies in movement are not individual bodies. They are worlding bodies that are one with the potential of movement. We are changed by our actions in the world and by the world. And the world is changed by us. That's the critical part I think we need to really attend to here, because responsibility means recognizing that the world that is changing you is the world that you are changing. And that is the essence of relationality, is that you are making a difference, whether you are awake to it or not. Bruno Latour says, an inarticulate subject is someone who, whatever the other says or acts, always feels, acts, and says the same thing. In contrast to an articulate subject, is someone who learns to be affected by others, not by itself. So the focus, mindfulness focuses on ourselves, but in focusing inwardly, we notice there is change. And the change is our ability to recognize change within our being can become our ability to recognize change that is the world when we start to become present to our extended selves, the selves that are in the somatic extension, the self that is engaged, intercorporeally engaged as a tree. That change that I am is the mindful act. It appears to be an outwardly moving action. And yet, when the self I am is also the tree, where do I begin and end? Right? I'm constantly in motion. I'm volatile as a presence. I'm not stable as a presence. And what Latour is saying is, to the degree that I pretend that I'm stable as a presence, I'm inarticulate. I can't speak. I can't make the move. I can't form the words. I'm making sounds, but they are not articulate sounds. So my interest is in what's articulate about presence and how can we be more skillful in that. Recognizing our instability as presence is really critical. And it's not just about articulating presence in performance. Natasha Myers and Joe Duma wrote an essay a few years back about in which they were thinking about the articulation as not a single positioning, but rather as many shifting affective positionings with distinct influences. They say they think about this in terms of working with scientists trying to feel what a relationship of one cell is to another. They will embody that sense of a cell, or in understanding where the ground is moving when looking at a geological phenomenon. They will put their bodies in the fact of their research, feeling those relationships in order to better understand them. And this dance that they do of knowing as both an intellectual exercise, but also as a physical exercise, is another form of attempting to understand the world through embodied practices. Those embodied practices change them. They're not the same. They're not a stable presence when they do that. They're an unstable presence, just as the world itself is unstable. Moving within our multisensorial articulations and deep logic, which is something of terminology by Kozel, we discover new responsivities and new means of identifying the self that is a multiple sensing dancer entangled with our sources, our our choreographic sources, whether that happens to be another person, whether it happens to be a tree or a forest that we're walking through, whether it happens to be a geography that is in the moment of collapse even. So I don't want to go too much further here before we start talking. I want to raise a few other little points here. The ability to shift our modes of embodiment is critical to the creative impulse, an impulse exposed as much by the extension of our ever-curious self-sensing as it is by its self-preservation and the need to know, a drive that underlies Spinoza's concept of kinitas. And so I want to turn to Spinoza because of his term kinitas, which is the endeavor to persist in being. That we are always turned towards the world because we need to persist. But the interesting thing about Spinoza, which is why I love his work so much, is that he says basically that the and I'm looking here, that the imagination, that the mind is the idea of the body, and that this idea is inseparable from the imagination. So we organize, that organizing to know the world that influences our presence is an organizing that is bound up in our ability to imagine. It's inseparable from our imagination. And it is the body's idea of being. So as a body mind, and I had to write my whole dissertation using the term body mind because they're inseparable. And I had to work with Spinoza because this inseparability is bound up in the imagination of the body, the mind, the body that is present as a mind, that imagines the possibility. Imagination is by definition the awareness of our bodies together with others. Thus, the interaction between bodies essentially involves imagination. But this bodily awareness, which is the very nature of imagination, is also closely bound up with kinitas. Bodies and minds as finite individuals struggle of their own nature to persist in being. Our bodies are not just passively moved by external forces. They have their own momentum, their own characteristic force for existing. But this is not something that individuals exert of their own power alone. For an individual to preserve itself in existence, as we have seen, is precisely for it to act and be acted upon in a multiplicity of ways. The more complex the individual body, the more ways in which it can be affected and affect other things. The power to imagine is thus integral to the continued existence and thriving of the individual. To define imagination in terms of bodily awareness within the context of Spinoza's philosophy is to move imagination to the very center of the story of human well-being and flourishing. And that is written by Gaydens and Lloyd in speaking about Spinoza's work, everything I just said about the imagination. Anyway, so basically, the end product of all of this is that it is the imagination that gives rise to this possibility of articulating our presence. And the more we get inside what that is and how that functions, the more play we have. as beings. There's a whole thing I could get into that has to do with the oppression of our cultural notions of being, the stability of that insistence that we be stable as present. That's another whole story. Anyway, I'd like to open this conversation up. I've just said a whole bunch of stuff and see what you guys think. What does this do to you? What interests you about presence?
That's a lot, and I was thinking, okay, I need to go and read a little bit again of Spinoza, because that's his quote that I love most about the how it's called. Freedom is the aware necessity of that's his phrase originally that I love most, and that's
freedom is the bare necessity of what?
Aware, like, is the necessity that you're fully aware of. I don't remember, and I know it in Russian and Ukrainian, but I don't know the original in English.
In English, right. That would be an interesting quote to figure out.
Fine. Yeah, because it's, and I'm intrigued by the fact that you relate to such profound things about relation with the world in his other works, but
yeah. Spinoza was influenced by Descartes, interestingly, but he came after. He was just he was in Germany. He came up after Descartes, and he was these ideas of his put him he was a very spiritual man, but they put him into conflict with the church. And he was basically excommunicated. You know, he was pushed aside. He was culturally pushed aside for sure. He was a very daring thinker. And he dared to think of the mind and body as this highly influencing event of being. The mind as, in some ways, the dream of the body. I mean, not exactly, but the mind is something that is arising as a result of body imagining itself into being. So that sense that the imagination is foundational to our being, and we let it go. In our culture, we really do not attend to the imagination. I had a professor when I was getting my PhD, who profoundly objected to my saying such a thing, that every moment is the imagination is present in every moment of being. If one accepts Spinoza's premise, then it would necessarily have to be so.
I'm really, can I share something?
Go for it.
I'm really interested by this idea of imagination as a kind of, you know, and this trio with relationality, but that's another thing. But something with and presence, but something about imagination almost being like a neutral force. I'm kind of interested in my own work right now about, you know, there's sort of some factions of the dance world that are like, well, the body is just this good virgin territory and it counters all the bad capitalist things, and you know, and that, and I just don't think that's true. But what maybe is something interesting is that as we imagine it, this kind of, you know, what's imagined and arises out of the body then impacts the reality, and that can go in lots of different directions that are more and less attractive.
Right. And society spends an incredible amount of effort to control that imagination, to organize it, to shape and form it, to inform it, in fact, so that it is not quite as boundless as the freedom that Alex was talking about.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, I would agree with you completely, Julia, that the body is not this neutral territory. You know, and all bodies are the body is already shaped culturally by the time it's born, actually. I mean, there's through gestation, the body is already in its shape, being influenced by culture, by the culture of the mother. So there's no neutrality. The notion of a neutral anything, it seems problematic. The only blank canvas that we have, as far as I'm concerned, is the blank canvas we can imagine.
So, and also,
I mean, it's like the silence we can imagine that doesn't exist. Silence doesn't exist. It is imagined, and the same with neutrality. It doesn't exist, it is imagined. So I agree with you wholly. Go ahead. You were just about to say something.
I think I was just gonna say, I wanted to return a little. You had a really interesting phrase, which was about, something being the articulation of present. Was it imagination is the articulation of presence, or relation? This thing about relationality and presence, and how presence relates to relationality. And I guess I think I'm asking, do you have an opinion? Do you have opinions about what is the moment of relationality? Is it an exchange? Does it have some kind of a dynamic for you, or some kind of a taste for you, or is it ever changing? Do you have?
So I begin with the idea that every moment is relational. And when I use the term relationality, it's much as I'm using the term attentionality. Attentionality means attention to attention. Relationality means my relational understanding of relations. So if I'm being relational with you, and if I'm attending to the relationality of you and me, I'm attending to how we are being relational with one another. But if I'm in relations with you, that is the thing itself, that I am changing you and you are changing me. And that's going to be organized through in many ways, and not perfectly, imperfectly, through my attention. Because there's always that which I'm attending to that I don't know I'm attending to. There's always the fact that I am not a singularity. I'm not a singular being attending. I am always a multiplicity attending as well. And that multiplicity that I am, that is also in relations, is going to be influenced and influencing. And I have access to that knowing through my subconscious when I have access to my subconscious self. But if I don't have access to my subconscious self, I'm not going to know. I'm going to think I'm a singularity. Which is why in dancing, I'm always saying, hold yourself lightly. Because if you hold yourself lightly, then you can start to hear and engage with what's coming up with the subconscious being. You'll notice movement that is moving you. You won't only be moving as if it was yourself moving. And the self that is a complex self, meaning it's both a singular and it's a multiple, has far greater access to its articulations than does the self that thinks it's a singular. And that's a whole bunch of what we do in relational intelligence, is dismantle that notion of a singular self and dismantle the notion of a skin-bound self, a flesh-bound self. Dismantle the notion that we're a body with a mind.
What about the idea that I can't remember, you said at some point something about the mind, or maybe I'm confusing, being larger than the body, or like the imagination influencing the body?
Yeah, the imagination definitely influences the imagination. I mean, if I'm speaking Spinoza, or if I'm speaking Nita, I'll speak Nita. The imagination is present as a body. And as a body, it gives rise to possibilities, to ideas of being in every moment. And that being that I am articulates my presence to the degree that I understand it's articulate. Otherwise, presence is doing what it's doing. And it is in motion, it is in change, and it wouldn't necessarily be articulate, meaning able to have influence in a form of communication, be communicative.
So in a way, it exists outside the body. It takes form in the body, but it's like something which is always
imagination.
Present. Yeah,
imagination absolutely is present, and absolutely influences the quality and various aspects of your presence as I experience you. my mother was an interesting example. My mother was a small woman with a very loud presence. she was in many ways uncontainable as a presence. She walked fast, she walked hard. She opened a door and entered a room, and she basically owned the room. It was very difficult for my mother to be a quiet, delicate flower. Could not, she didn't exist that way. And my mother believed she had no imagination. I mean, she would speak of it that way. She would say, I can't imagine anything. But of course, she was always imagining this world that was available to her. She was always imagining the availability of the world. When people imagine the world is not available to them, you feel that. It's there in their presence. They are receding, in a sense. The child that doesn't make a lot of noise, the baby that doesn't smile, that doesn't blossom, that's problematic. Not that just being a delicate flower, that's a whole other valuable presence. That's another form of articulation. And in terms of what excites me, I really get excited by the possibility of being a presence that is almost invisible, to being a presence that can fill a stadium, so to speak. How is it that we can do that thing? If you've ever spent a lot of time in public view, doing a lot with a lot of people, and then you try and go and sit in a room by yourself, it's painful almost. You have to recede, bring it down, bring it down, bring it down, bring it down. And it's physical, it's a physical sensation to Have you ever had that sensation? Any of you? Yeah?
The opposite, like of feeling like stepping into leading a big group and reminding myself, okay, it's time to grow. You need to.
Right. Okay. Right. Right.
And then
the
calibrating.
painfulness of opening up. Right. And the vulnerability of knowing you're visible.
Mm-hmm.
Because the mind is physical. So it's seeable, it's knowable. When I watch people dance, I'm watching minds move.
It's also an interesting point about imagination, though, and relationality, because if you've ever, I had one particular experience of leading a big group and receiving a lot of projection from the group about who I was and what I cared about and all of this.
Right.
That became very real energetically and emotionally.
Yeah.
That was this kind of power, but really attention, imagination. So big learnings, big lessons there. Is really interesting and painful.
Painful. Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. So I'm not, we're talking not so much about what people are doing with their imagination, more about how they do what they do. And although the what really is significant. So
Yeah, apologies. I think I'm interested a little bit in how these things become concrete or might have impact. So that was where I was going. So I
no,
didn't
it's totally important. Don't apologize. I think that's really valuable. There is this this thing of how and what that is really, they're always working together. And that projection of the imagination on someone else, speaks very much to how it is we're not individuated. Someone else's imagination is touching us. We're touched by it. We are easily made at its effect. So learning to work with your imagination in such a way that you are transparent to it, that it can't touch you, that it can't, that you let it pass through. The projection just passes right through. That also is an act, a physical act of the imagination. You're not solid. Why? Because this thing that we do with the imagination is so profound. I think we barely know what we're doing in this landscape. I think there's so much to explore, so much to understand. I don't think it's fixed. I think I'm a baby at being, I think everything I've just spent time talking about is just the tip of a humongous iceberg.
Can I add a personal note?
Please go. I'm so glad to hear from you.
Yeah, I was late because I knew that I'm in Paris actually, and I'm moving out this weekend. So I wasn't sure if I catch the call, but I was out in the park near my current apartment, saying goodbye to the trees that have been my friends for 12 years, and yeah, that's why I was late for the call. But yeah, that resonates in so many levels, that gives at the same time like a structure of how I was feeling from this morning. I was feeling very anxious, and I was wondering why, because yeah, I put the word anxiety. I don't know why that was, but something very agitated inside of me, and I tried to tend to myself and yeah, to stay with this as you say, the flesh bound entity. And yeah, the time passed by, and when I went to the park and stayed much more open to the land and all the environments where I'm at, it was this something like coming from, at the same time, from inside of me, but also from all the different areas that are much more open than me and my apartment and my little space, and the openness afterward, and the time that I needed to stay at that place, that resonates very much.
Yeah, I think that the way, when we think about our presence as articulate and as really changing us on a deep level. So if you're feeling too small, the space is too small for you, you're right. But if you're feeling that allowing yourself to open up and let the trees speak inside of you, that you are allowing yourself to be available to the world and allowing the world to touch you on the inside of being, not the outside of being. You're not always engaged through a in a sense, allow the possibility that the you that is you is inclusive of the size you are. So that everything is not mediated just the way within your own being. One part is not mediating what's happening with another necessarily. They're all working for your well-being. All parts are doing what they're doing in order to support, in a sense, imperfectly so, allowing for imperfection. Yes, there is plenty inside of you that is not human, but you are always both human and not human. You're from the inside out, you're human and not human. And I'm simply suggesting that presence allows you to expand what that is, expand the skin of being, so to speak.
Yeah.
Oh, we just lost Amanda, but okay, I want to see what she said in chat. Amanda, to everyone, I'm going to make myself a hot drink while we wait. One thing is called free, which exists solely by the necessity of its own nature, and of which the action is determined by itself alone. On the other hand, that thing is necessary, or rather constrained, which is determined by something external to itself, to a fixed and definite method of existence or action. She's taking that from ethic, and she wrote Ethica, definition number 7. I wonder if that's Spinoza's ethics that she's speaking of. The thing is called free, which exists solely by the necessity of its own nature, and of which the action is determined by itself alone. On the other hand, the thing is necessary, or rather constrained, which is determined by something external to itself, to a fixed or definite method of existence or action. Right, so which is, in my way of speaking, to say that freedom is a myth, because we're always, the world is necessary to my existence. And my existence is necessary to the world. Anyway, that's a whole other conversation that we cannot get into. I need to hop off. Thank you, Nita, for this talk. Okay, too bad. I'd love to get into that one with her, but that's huge. So it is already 10:05, guys. I really enjoyed just having time to chat about various subjects and hear from you what is interesting to your thinking, what you're thinking about.
Recently, I'm looking for the keys to these free and performative and creative life, like moving out from the dance itself, from this box of looking at the dance as a dance, and that's where all these philosophy things start to happen, and that's interesting. Like meeting the questions of freedom, of other people, of imagining the world. Yeah, it's true, and dealing with the mind and ideas and the big so it's very intriguing for me to how to extend the presence that I am in a dancing space, so to say, into different aspects of my being.
Yeah, I think one of the things I find interesting about culture and being social, in being a social being, is that culture very often tells you how to be present. The quality, the nature of your presence. We tell each other how to do that. We tend to mirror one another's presence in this kind of amazing dance in which the imagination gets caught in reproduction. It doesn't reproduce difference, it reproduces sameness. And that breaking that cycle of sameness, that cycle of reproducing an imagined being, so that you can be different, so that you can know something anew, that's really critical. That's taking the dance into your life.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I call upon myself. And when I think about relations, Alex, I think that every moment I'm in relation, so every moment is an opportunity for my imagination to be arriving and arising anew. Julia, super interesting, and thank you. I appreciate your being here, Julia. Really a pleasure.